Buenos días a todas y a todos, a quienes acaban de llegar y se incorporan a este seminario internacional. Vamos a dar paso a la conferencia magistral Gobernar los estados en el siglo XXI, para lo cual cedo la palabra a la doctora Luz María Parcero de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Adelante, doctora.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Es para mí un honor moderar esta mesa. Agradezco, por supuesto, al profesor Robledo, al doctor Alejandro Chanona, a la coordinadora del posgrado, a la doctora Valverde, por esta consideración. Tenemos ahora esta mesa denominada Gobernar los estados en el siglo XXI y nuestro conferencista magistral es el doctor Bob Jessop, quien se encuentra en línea. Les hago la presentación de una breve semblanza. El doctor Jessop es catedrático de Sociología en la Universidad de Lancaster, especialista en teoría del Estado y en economía política. Estudió Sociología en la Universidad de Exeter, realizando posteriormente su doctorado en Sociología Política en Cambridge. La teoría política de Jessop se basa principalmente en considerar al Estado no como algo estático, fruto de una correlación de clases en disputa por el poder, ni tampoco como el centro desde donde la burguesía define las políticas en base a sus prioridades e intereses, sino como una construcción histórica y geográfica, fruto de la interrelación de diferentes estrategias políticas y económicas sobre la cual se construye el poder estatal. Su formación teórica se sustenta en las interpretaciones que el propio Marx define sobre el capital financiero y su relación directa con lo social. Además, se sustenta en las tesis desarrolladas durante el siglo XX por Antonio Gramsci o Nikos Poulantzas, quienes concebían al Estado como una relación social, profundizando sobre las contradicciones y las relaciones entre el Estado y las estructuras de clase, un concepto que Jessop denomina como selectividad estratégica. Entre sus obras se encuentran State Power, Strategic Relational Approach, y junto con Guy Lin Sum, Towards a Cultural Political Economy, Putting Culture in its Place in Political Economy, the State, Past, Present, Future. Me da mucho gusto que lo recibamos en este evento como conferencista magistral, y les comento que quienes estarán a cargo de los comentarios de esta ponencia son la doctora Judith Boxer Mises, de quien después daré su semblanza, y el doctor Fernando Castañeda Zuno. Adelante, por favor, un gusto tenerle aquí, doctor Jessop.
Right, thank you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, so I'm coming online, and I hope you can follow my presentation. And my topic is governing states in the 21st century. This is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to present a conventional approach to states and statehood. I'm then going to define the normal state as a reference point for discussing other forms of state. And in that context, I will introduce the idea of temporal sovereignty, which is one of the aspects of the state today, which is under great challenge, especially in the 21st century. I'm then going to deal with 4 dimensions of state spatiality, and then I'm going to introduce the ideas of the state in its integral sense from Gramsci and modify it in the light of the ideas of Foucault. And then, because the topic of this whole conference is on modes of governance, I'm going to introduce you to 4 modes of governance and define their relationship. That leads me in turn to discuss meta-governance and calibration, both of which terms I will define. And then in terms of the long period of state formation, I'll discuss multispatial meta-governance. Then I'll finally turn to some challenges of the 21st century, not all of which began in the 21st century. And then I'll reach some conclusions. So let's start with what is the state? And I think there are three aspects of a conventional aspect of the state. The idea is that a territory is controlled by the state. An apparatus makes collectively binding decisions for a resident population subject to state authority. And you'll find this idea presented in the work of Max Weber, Karl Marx, many other state theorists. What we have to do, though, is to recognize that state capacities and state strength vary immensely. There's no general form of the state, and as there are big differences, especially in policy regimes, no general theory of the state is possible. Finally, all states are equal, but some are more equal than others. Some states have more power to shape the world order, most recently, of course, the United States of America, and state strength is linked in part to states' overall power resources, in part to the choice it makes between military and welfare spending. And that's the basic idea of the state. But what I want to do now is to discuss the normal state form, because not all states are the same. And one of the reasons that we can't develop a general theory of the state is that because there are many different forms of state. So we can define the normal state form as a reference point for thinking about the state in terms of the national territorial state. But in addition, there are states that claim extraterritorial reach, for example, the United States and Russia and China increasingly. And we also have the camp, which are forms of concentration camp or other forms of camp taking place within the framework of the national territorial state. Another normal feature of states is the states based on the constitutional state or the rule of law, but most states temporarily suspend the rule of law in case of emergencies. The normal form of state, again, is considered to be the liberal bourgeois democracy, but there are many kinds of exceptional regimes that suspend elections, suspend the rule of law, and introduce various forms of dictatorship. The normal form of state is a tax state. That is to say, it separates the economy and the political and raises its revenues either by taxation or by borrowing on the basis of its ability to raise tax revenues. And in addition, we can see exceptions to this in terms of predatory kleptocracies, that is to say, states based on theft. We have the examples of fiscal crisis which prevent the states raising money, and we have the ideas of default states. And finally, a normal form of state has temporal sovereignty. That is to say, it is able to make decisions according to its own temporal rhythms and routines. And this is subject to challenge, and increasingly so, by emergencies and urgencies. So moving on to more thoughts on temporal sovereignty, I define temporal sovereignty as the ability of the state to make decisions according to its own criteria and temporal rhythms. In other words, the state is able to follow its own rules and procedures in making decisions. And this can take time according to how long it takes to get legislation through Parliament, how long it takes to implement legislation, and so forth. But this is under challenge, the ability of the state to make its decisions according to its own criteria and temporal rhythms due to time-space compression and to the acceleration of social relations on a world scale. In other words, the state is losing its ability to make decisions according to its own criteria and procedural rhythms laid down in the Constitution. And its responses to that include abandon attempts to control short-term economic calculation, activities and movements, but try to control medium to long-term economic decisions and movements. So it doesn't try to intervene and determine exactly what happens within the economy through micromanagement and immediate interventions, but tries to control the medium to long-term economic decisions and movements. And this is one feature of neoliberalism. It can also attempt to compress its decision-making cycles to enable more timely and apt state interventions, so it can speed up decision-making, pass legislation more quickly, even in one day in the case of the United Kingdom. It can plan decision-making in terms of policy options and so forth, and it can try to create relative political time by slowing the circuits of fast capitalism, which lead to time-space compression and the acceleration of social relations on a world scale. Each of these responses is likely to fail, but I think one of the important features that I want to emphasize today is the importance of governance failure. Now we're turning to the 4 dimensions of state spatiality. So to start with, I began with the idea of the state as being the political territorialization. That is to say, the political control of territory as one of the 3 defining features of the state. And we can see this in terms of one dimension of state spatiality, territory. That is to say, the organization of space by drawing frontiers, borders, and boundaries, and distinguishing between inside and outside. But there are also important aspects of the spatiality of the state. There's the relationship between places, and these places are based on proximity, the spatial embedding, and the differentiation of areas. So if you look at states today, they have cores and centers, peripheries, they have local authorities, they have regional authorities, and so forth. And this is based on place and it's related to the spatial division of labor. We can also talk about scale, which is the nested hierarchy of social relations based on vertical differentiation. And if we look at the history of states, it's not always been the national state, which is the peak of the hierarchy. So in the 19th century in Britain, local authorities were more important than national authorities. And if we look today, we can see the emergence of scales that are important above the level of the national state, for example, the European Union. And finally, we can talk about networks as the connection among nodes based on transversal or rhizomatic differentiation. Rhizomatic differentiation has the idea of the roots of a plant which spread in different directions, and networks can be connected based on rhizomatic differentiation. So these are the 4 dimensions of state spatiality. And when we talk about governance, we need to think about the governance of the 4 dimensions, basic dimensions of the state's spatiality. I'm now going to turn to Gramsci, who focused on the modalities of state power rather than its specific institutional mediations. So if we take my basic definition of the state as based on territory, authority, and resident population, when Gramsci was writing, Italy was still in the process of developing its own state, and it did not have a clearly defined crisis-free state. And he focused more on the modalities of state power rather than its specific institutional mediations. In other words, he looked beyond the state in its juridico-political sense to state power as a social relations. And in this sense, he defined lo stato integrale, the state in its integral or inclusive sense, as political society plus civil society. And he argued that the state power in the West, as opposed to the East, was characterized by hegemony armored by coercion. And force was the use of a coercive operation to bring popular masses into conformity with the requirements of the specific mode of production. And hegemony was when the ruling class mobilizes the active consent of dominated groups by intellectual, moral, and political leadership. And he argued that if we want to try to understand the nature of state power, we have to look not just at the state in its institutional dimensions, but also in terms of the ways in which power was exercised. And in that regard, in terms of comparative analysis, he looked at the relative weight across different societies of coercion, fraud, corruption, passive revolution, and active consent. And these are a spectrum running from brute force to fraud, corruption, passive revolution, which is the top-down decapitation of grassroots movements, so they lost their leadership, and the mobilization of active consent. And I want to redefine Gramsci's approach in terms of governance and governmentality. And I will define that then in terms of state equals government plus governance in the shadow of hierarchy. And in this regard, government is more than the state considered as a territory, apparatus, and population. It exercises power in ways that go well beyond imperative coordination dependent on the passage of legislation by the state. Government as a social relation, hegemony armored by coercion or statecraft, involves the practices of calibration, that is to say, rebalancing forms of governance in the shadow of hierarchy, and as such is linked to issues of domination. And calibration is more than a technical problem-solving fix tied to wider unstable equilibrium of compromise, and it has specific objects, techniques, and subjects of governance. And I'll now introduce you to the idea of governance and calibration. So 4 modes of governance can be defined: exchange, command, dialogue, and solidarity. The rationality of exchange is formal and procedural. There is, in other words, no way in which the market is directly governed. Its procedures are informal and procedural. In other words, markets work through following rules of economic calculation. Command, which is top-down, is substantive and goal-oriented. So it's the state exercises power and tries to achieve collective goals. Dialogue is reflexive and procedural in character. In other words, it involves argument and follows procedures that have no fixed outcome, but are arrived at through negotiated consent. And solidarity is unreflexive and value-oriented. The key medium of exchange is money. The key medium of command is coercion. The key meaning of dialogue is meaning-making. And the key medium of solidarity is commitment. The ideal type of markets are derivatives markets. The ideal type of command is the sovereign state. The ideal type of dialogue is an open network. And the ideal form of solidarity is requited love, that is to say, love that is returned. The criterion of success for exchange is the efficient allocation of scarce resources to competing goals. The efficient criterion of command is effective goal attainment. That is to say, the state commits itself to achieve a collective goal and actually achieves it. The key criterion of success of dialogue is negotiated consent, and the criterion of success for solidarity as an unconditional commitment. And if we say that all forms of governance fail, we recognize the failure of exchange in terms of inefficient allocation, in terms of command, ineffective goal attainment, in terms of dialogue, that parliaments become a talking shop rather than negotiate consent. And in terms of solidarity, the main sign of failure is betrayal, that the commitments have been betrayed. And I now want to introduce the idea of meta-governance. Each mode of governance can fail to realize its objectives. This leads both to attempts to correct it on its own terrain. So you redesign the ways in which markets operate, you redesign the state, you redesign networks, you redesign solidarity, and so you can attempt to correct governance failure in its own terrain or to combine forms of governance to compensate for their respective failures. Meta-governance refers to the governance of governance, and collaboration, which I introduced earlier, refers to attempts to engage in meta-governance by adjusting the relations among modes of governance. And I prefer collaboration here to equilibration, because collaboration involves several modes of governance, and I prefer the term collaboration then to equilibration, which has two modes, like weighing a scale. So if you think of when you're weighing something, you have weights on one side and something you're weighing on the other side, and you try to bring them into balance. But that's equilibration, and collaboration involves different modes of governance. And I want to say here that the state is an important mode of collaboration, and its activities reflect the changing balance of forces. So we can talk about the different ways in which the state engages in the collaboration of governance. It provides ground rules for governance. It creates forums or organizes dialogue among partners. It ensures the coherence of regimes across scales and over time. It rebalances power differentials and the strategic bias implicit in a given regime. So if the working class becomes too powerful, it tries to limit the power of the working class. And if business becomes too powerful, it tries to increase the power of the working class. And it tries also to modify the strategic selectivity or bias of the states. It attempts to intervene on self-understandings, on interest, identities, and so on. So when people are engaged in dialogue or pursuing their interests within the political arena, it tries to modify the ways in which people understand their interests and identities. It tries to subsidize the production of public goods, organize side payments for those making sacrifices, and so on. It exercises supervision, that is to say, it tries to see more and to supervise what's going on, permitting the expansion, shrinkage, or adjustment of governance. And it identifies the final responsibility for when governance fails. So if the markets fail, it tries to identify what compensates for market failure. When governance fails, it tries to compensate for what happens when the states fail and so forth. And finally, I want to talk about the state coordinating multi-spatial meta-governance. That is to say, the state coordinates the spatial dimensions of governance. It involves it in mediating interterritorial relations between states. It involves the interscalar dimensions of states, taking what takes place within the state, outside the state, and beyond states. It involves also cross-border regional governance and so forth. It modifies interplace relations, federal and confederal relations, and it promotes solidarity. And the state has increased its level of multi-spatial meta-governance following the end of empires and colonies and the rise of confederal states such as the European Union. And now I'm going to come to the challenges of the 21st century. And I said at the beginning, not all of these are new to the 21st century, but they may have intensified since then. So one aspect of the challenges of the 21st century is the increased importance of rapid technological change and the disruptions that occurs to established relations, to established institutions, authorities, and so forth. We can talk also about the rise and expansion of BRICS, that is to say, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and also added early on was South Africa, which gives you the mnemonic BRICS. But we can also say that the BRICS have been continued to expand, and as the BRICS have expanded, they're challenging the dominance of the United States. And one of the reactions to this has been Trump's introduction of tariffs and his mercantilism and trying to attract investment back into the United States. And I think this is, whereas the rise and expansion of BRICS predates the 21st century, Trump's tariffs and mercantilism are clearly a product of the 21st century. But how long they will last and how long the tariffs will endure is still open to debate. Another challenge of the 21st century is the rising inequalities of wealth and income, which are in part associated with the development of neoliberalism, but also the growing differentiation between states as they become more or less wealthy, as they grow and expand. Another aspect of one of the challenges of the 21st century is the popular distrust of states and governance. As the challenges have increased, people have become to trust states and governance less. They trust nation states less, they trust local states less, regional states less, federal states less, and so forth. And this leads to an increasing illegitimacy of states and governance. A further challenge of the 21st century is the increasing migration and mobility. People trying to move away from states in crisis, states subject to climate change, to rising levels of seawater and so forth, and people moving away from societies in which warfare is taking place. So we see an increasing array of migrations within states and between states, between and the attempts by, and that threatens the territoriality of states. So increasingly, states are worried about the effects of in-migration, of the inability to house migrants and so forth. Another challenge is the rise of climate change and the commitment to net zero. So climate change is man-made, as we know, it's anthropomorphic, but it also leads to growing challenges across nations. So desert countries are more affected by climate change than temperate powers. The Arctic and the Antarctic ice is melting, and that's raising sea levels. And one of the ways in which we see the attempts to respond to climate change are attempts to move towards net zero, that is to say, no new additions to global warming after 2050, with other countries trying to get there closer. So Britain is committed at the moment to trying to get to 80% of net zero by 2030, and finding that difficult as well. So increasingly, states are challenged by climate change, the commitments to net zero, and indeed whether we'll still be here by the end of the 21st century is an open question. Another change which could be related to technological disruption is the rise of artificial intelligence. That is to say, the rise of computers in order to try to reproduce the ways in which the mind thinks, and to move towards generic artificial intelligence. That is to say, to solve problems that humans can't. And I think this is a major challenge to governments and governance in the 21st century. And we're seeing big debates within the United States, within the United Kingdom, within Europe, and so forth, on how governments and states should govern the introduction of artificial intelligence. And people are worried about whether or not artificial intelligence could launch wars on their own initiative, and indeed abolish states. And finally, a final challenge is the rise of authoritarian statism and populism. Authoritarian statism has been there for a long time, but I think we can say that authoritarian statism has grown since the 1970s, when the post-war consensus and the post-war institutional order became under threat, became under crisis, and the rise of authoritarian states emerged. And I think finally, authoritarian statism is linked to the rise of authoritarian populism. And again, this is not something peculiar to the 21st century, but something that has been occurring in a more detailed way in the 21st century. This brings me to my conclusions. We can see the decline of the post-war consensus and rule-based order and its linked forms of imperial domination. So while people talk about the post-war order as the rise of liberal bourgeois democracies and the development of welfare states and so forth, there's been a decline of post-war consensus and the rules-based order with its Bretton Woods, IMF, and other institutions, and its linked forms of imperial domination. So the post-war consensus and rule-based order were linked with the rise of imperial domination, the decline of the British Empire, but the rise of the United States as the leading power in the world. And so this is one of the ways in which governance is being reordered in the 21st century. Secondly, we can talk about the proliferation of polycrises, that is to say, multiple crises with multiple dimensions. So we no longer have economic crises or political crises or social crises or environmental crises, but interlinked crises which make it much more difficult to govern them, regulate them, and bring them under control. So the proliferation of polycrises is an aspect of the 21st century which is important and needs to be taken account of. That in turn leads to the search for new forms of governance and meta-governance to deal with these challenges. And one of the ways in which I've talked about that is the increased role of multispatial meta-governance. That is to say, states are trying to intervene in many different spaces, territories, places, networks, and solidarity, and try to bring the polycrisis under some form of control. And finally, in terms of the growing importance of networks and solidarity, to compensate for growing market and state failure, and importance of networks and solidarity to develop new social imaginaries as the basis for ecological crisis resolution. And I think that's one of the most important challenges of the 21st century, which is the need to deal with environmental pollution, climate change, ecological crisis, and the effects of that also on growing migration and mobility. And in order to resolve these, we can't rely just on market forces or top-down state imperative coordination. We need to rely on networks and solidarity and to develop new social imaginaries as the basis for ecological crisis resolution. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I look forward to receiving the comments and then questions. Thank you.